There was a moment over North Vietnam when American pilots looked into the sky and realized something deeply uncomfortable. The enemy fighter coming toward them was smaller, lighter, less heavily armed, and, on paper, far less sophisticated than the American aircraft carrying them into combat. Yet somehow, it kept appearing where American pilots did not expect it. The aircraft was the Soviet-built MiG-21. To American aircrews flying over North Vietnam in the 1960s, the MiG-21 was more than another enemy fighter. It was a problem. A problem measured in seconds. A problem measured in missile launches, radar contacts, disappearing targets, and aircraft that never came home. The skies around Hanoi became one of the most dangerous laboratories of the Cold War. American F-105 Thunder Chiefs and F-4 Phantoms entered North Vietnamese airspace carrying bombs, missiles, fuel, electronic equipment, and enormous expectations. But waiting for them was an enemy that seemed to understand something the Americans had underestimated. The MiG-21 did not need to dominate the entire sky. It only needed to choose the right moment. It could climb rapidly. It could accelerate hard. It could attack at high speed. And when its pilot decided the fight was no longer favorable, the little Soviet fighter could disappear almost as quickly as it had arrived. For American pilots, the question became brutally simple. How do you defeat an aircraft when you don't completely understand how it fights? The answer would eventually take American intelligence officers thousands of miles away from Vietnam. It would involve a defector, an Iraqi MiG-21, Israel, a secret agreement, a highly classified American test program, and a lonely airfield in the Nevada desert that would later become famous as Area 51. But the story did not begin in Nevada. It began over Hanoi, the sky over Hanoi. In the mid-1960s, the United States possessed some of the most advanced combat aircraft on Earth. American aircraft designers had spent years building faster jets, more powerful radar systems, better missiles, and increasingly sophisticated electronics. The logic seemed straightforward. If American aircraft could fly faster, carry more weapons, detect targets at greater distances, and strike from beyond visual range, then air combat should increasingly resemble an engineering problem. But Vietnam challenged that assumption. The skies over North Vietnam were not an empty arena where two aircraft could simply meet and determine which machine had better specifications. They were crowded, confusing, and dangerous. There were surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, radar networks, weather, clouds, mountains, political restrictions, rules of engagement, and enemy fighters operating within a carefully constructed defensive system. The North Vietnamese Air Force did not need to send hundreds of aircraft into the sky. It needed to send the right aircraft at the right time. And one of the most important was the MiG-21. The Soviet fighter was radically different from the large American jets flying above Vietnam. The MiG-21 was compact and streamlined. Its nose contained a large circular intake. Its wings were small and sharply swept. Its design emphasized speed, climb, and interception. It was not built to carry enormous bomb loads. It was not designed as a long-range strike aircraft. It was built to get into the air quickly, reach high speed, attack, and survive. And that design philosophy mattered. Because American pilots were learning that air combat was not necessarily won by the aircraft with the biggest radar, the most powerful engine, or the greatest number of weapons. Sometimes it was won by the aircraft that forced the other pilot to make the wrong decision. The fishbed. NATO gave the MiG-21 the reporting name Fishbed. The name sounded almost harmless. The aircraft was anything but harmless. The MiG-21 represented a generation of Soviet thinking about air combat. It was compact. It was fast. It had a powerful engine for its size. And its shape gave it a distinctive combination of acceleration and high-speed performance. To an American pilot, however, the most dangerous thing about the MiG-21 was not one individual statistic. It was the combination. A small target, a high-speed interceptor, a capable cannon, air-to-air missiles, and a pilot who could exploit the confusion of a large American strike package. The MiG-21 could attack quickly and then attempt to disengage before American fighters could organize a response. This was especially important because American aircraft were often carrying out missions that were not designed primarily for air-to-air combat. Bombers and fighter bombers had targets, routes, timetables, fuel limitations, and formations to protect. The North Vietnamese MiG pilots were fighting a different kind of war. They could wait, they could climb, they could use ground control, and they could choose moments when American formations were vulnerable. Suddenly, the enormous technological advantage the United States believed it possessed became much harder to translate into victories. When technology failed to guarantee victory, American fighter doctrine had increasingly embraced the idea that missiles and advanced technology would transform aerial warfare. The future appeared to belong to radar-guided weapons and sophisticated electronics. But combat exposed the gap between theory and reality. A missile that looked perfect during testing could behave differently in combat. A radar system that performed beautifully under controlled conditions could become much less useful when the target was maneuvering, terrain was interfering, or rules of engagement prevented the pilot from firing. And perhaps most importantly, a pilot who had never personally fought against a MiG-21 did not necessarily understand what the aircraft could do. This was the central problem. American pilots were training against American aircraft. They knew the capabilities of their own machines. They knew the approximate performance of other Western aircraft. But the MiG-21 was different. How tightly could it turn? How quickly could it climb? At what speed did it become most dangerous? How rapidly could it accelerate? How long could it sustain a maneuver? What happened if an F-4 tried to follow it? What happened if an American fighter refused to turn? What would the MiG pilot do? What would he avoid? Where was the MiG vulnerable? And perhaps the most important question of all, what did the MiG-21 pilot see when he looked at an American F-4? Those questions could not be answered completely from photographs. They could not be answered by intelligence reports alone, and they certainly could not be answered by studying a captured engine sitting on a laboratory floor. American pilots needed something much more valuable. They needed to fly the enemy aircraft. The F-4 Phantom meets the MiG-21. The F-4 Phantom II was one of the most important American fighters of the Vietnam era. It was fast, powerful, twin-engined, capable of carrying substantial weapons. It could operate in multiple roles and was designed around the idea that advanced radar and missiles would give American crews an enormous advantage. But the F-4 was also a large aircraft. The MiG-21 was much smaller. That difference affected the visual fight. A MiG-21 could be difficult to see. It could enter a fight with tremendous energy. And because of its compact design, it could present a small visual target to an American pilot trying to track it. The Phantom had strengths the MiG did not. But strengths only mattered if pilots knew how to use them. A fighter pilot who allowed himself to be pulled into the wrong type of fight could surrender his aircraft's advantages. And the MiG-21 was particularly dangerous when American pilots allowed the engagement to become a contest of instinct rather than a carefully controlled tactical problem. This was not simply a question of aircraft performance. It was a question of knowledge. And knowledge was exactly what American intelligence wanted. Operation Baffled changes the game. The United States was already learning how to exploit North Vietnamese fighter tactics. One of the most famous examples came on January 2, 1967. The operation was called Baffled. American planners realized that the North Vietnamese were responding to recognizable patterns in American operations. So the Americans created a deception. F-4 Phantoms were used in a way designed to resemble the approach of F-105 strike aircraft. The trap worked. North Vietnamese MiG-21s were drawn into the fight. In a 12-minute engagement, 7 MiG-21s were reported shot down, approximately half of the operational force at the time, with no U.S. Air Force losses. Baffled proved something important. The MiG-21 could be beaten, but that did not mean the underlying problem had disappeared. The Americans had learned something about enemy behavior. Yet they still lacked a complete understanding of the aircraft itself. A fighter can be defeated once without being completely understood. And America wanted more than one victory. It wanted the blueprint. Not necessarily the engineering blueprint. The tactical blueprint. How the MiG moved. How it fought. How it responded. And how American pilots could force it into situations where its strengths became weaknesses. That meant America needed a MiG. A real one. The defector. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. Iraq. In August 1966, an Iraqi Air Force pilot named Munir Redfa flew a MiG-21 to Israel in a carefully arranged defection. The aircraft was not merely abandoned. Its arrival was an intelligence prize of extraordinary importance. Israel could now study an operational Soviet fighter that was difficult for Western nations to obtain, and the United States was extremely interested. The Cold War was not just a competition between armies. It was a competition between technologies. Radar against radar. Missile against countermeasure, engine against engine, and fighter against fighter. Possessing an actual MiG-21 meant the United States could finally test assumptions against reality. Israel eventually made the aircraft available to the United States. The American military received it under extraordinary secrecy. From January 23 to April 8, 1968, the aircraft was loaned to the U.S. Air Force. And then came one of the strangest journeys in aviation history. The MiG was going to America. But almost nobody was supposed to know. The journey to the desert. Imagine the logistics. An American intelligence organization suddenly possesses a Soviet fighter. The aircraft cannot simply be parked at an ordinary U.S. Air Force base. It cannot be publicly photographed. It cannot be displayed. It cannot appear in routine flight records. The Soviet Union must not know where it is. and the aircraft cannot simply be flown casually through American airspace. Everything about its movement must be controlled. The solution was secrecy. The MiG eventually reached the United States and was taken to Groom Lake, Nevada. Today, most Americans know Groom Lake by another name, Area 51. The location had already been associated with secret aircraft programs. It was isolated. It was secure. And it was far from curious eyes. The CIA had used the site for highly classified reconnaissance programs such as the U-2 and A-12 Oxguard. Now the desert would become the home of something completely different, a Soviet fighter. HAVE DOUGHNUT. The Americans gave the aircraft a new identity. The MiG-21 became the YF-110, and the evaluation program received an equally strange name, HAVE DOUGHNUT. The name sounds almost absurd when compared with the seriousness of the mission, but the work was anything but funny. The purpose was to understand the MiG-21, not from the perspective of a Soviet engineer, not from the perspective of a North Vietnamese pilot, but from the perspective of an American fighter pilot trying to survive an encounter with it. The U.S. Air Force's Foreign Technology Division became involved in the technical exploitation. Air Force and Navy personnel participated in the evaluation. The aircraft was examined. Its performance was studied. Its systems were analyzed. And then American pilots did something even more valuable. They fought it. The official objectives included evaluating existing American tactics against the MiG-21, understanding the aircraft's capabilities and limitations, developing tactics to defeat it, and evaluating its design and performance. For the first time, American fighter pilots could climb into an aircraft that represented the enemy. They could experience the world from inside the cockpit. And that changed everything. The enemy's view. Imagine sitting inside the MiG-21. The canopy closes. The aircraft is no longer an intelligence photograph. It is alive. The engine starts. The runway stretches ahead. And somewhere in the desert, an American F-4 is waiting. But now the American pilot has a problem. He is not fighting a theoretical MiG. He is fighting the exact aircraft he has been trying to understand. The MiG accelerates. The American aircraft follows. The fight begins. The fight begins. And suddenly, the Americans can ask questions they could never answer in a briefing room. What does the MiG look like when it is accelerating away? How quickly does it disappear? What does it look like when it turns? How much energy does it lose? How much energy does it retain? How much room does it need? When does its performance fall away? And what happens when an American pilot refuses to play by the MiG's preferred rules? These were not abstract questions. Every answer could eventually become a pilot's survival. The MiG's greatest strengths. The MiG-21's design was based on a very specific philosophy. Get airborne. Get fast. Get high. Live. It did not need to remain in the sky for hours. It did not need to carry a massive bomb load. It did not need to become a flying command center. It needed to be a fighter. And its compact size made it exceptionally difficult to see and track visually. That mattered enormously in an era when pilots often had to identify enemy aircraft before firing. The MiG could appear almost suddenly. And because it was so small, the pilot of a larger American aircraft could lose visual contact more easily. But the same design that made the MiG dangerous also created limitations. Its small size meant limited internal fuel. Its endurance was not unlimited. Its ability to sustain certain maneuvers was constrained by energy. And the aircraft's performance changed dramatically depending on speed and altitude. Those were exactly the kinds of details that American test pilots wanted to expose. The first great lesson. The Americans discovered something that sounds obvious today. There was no magical best fighter. There was only the fighter in the right situation. The MiG-21 could be extremely dangerous. But it could also be placed into situations where its advantages diminished. If an American pilot understood that, the entire engagement changed. Instead of reacting to the MiG, the American pilot could begin shaping the fight. That distinction was critical. A pilot who reacted to an enemy's movements was giving the enemy the initiative. A pilot who understood the enemy's limitations could force the enemy into an unwanted decision. That was what HAVE DOUGHNUT was really about. Not stealing the Soviet aircraft's secrets for curiosity. Not merely measuring its speed. But learning how to make an American pilot more dangerous. The fighter as a weapon. The American military had spent enormous resources building sophisticated fighters. But HAVE DOUGHNUT reinforced a difficult truth. A fighter is only part of a combat system. The aircraft, the pilot, the tactics, the weapons, the radar, the communications network, the intelligence, the training. Everything must work together. A superior aircraft flown with poor tactics can lose. A seemingly inferior aircraft flown by a skilled pilot can win. And a fighter that looks unbeatable in a specification sheet can become vulnerable when its opponent knows exactly how to fight it. The MiG-21 became a teacher. And it was teaching American pilots what not to do. Why the MiG could be so dangerous. The MiG-21's danger came from its ability to compress the engagement. American pilots could not afford to waste time. A high-speed fighter could enter weapons range quickly. That reduced the amount of time available for identification and decision-making. The MiG's small profile also made it harder to visually track. And the North Vietnamese did not necessarily need to engage in prolonged dogfights. They could make a short attack and attempt to escape. That meant American pilots needed to recognize the engagement before it became a crisis. The lessons from the desert were therefore not simply about turning circles. They were about awareness, position, energy, timing, and discipline. A pilot needed to understand what the MiG wanted, then deny it. The biggest mistake. One of the most dangerous things a fighter pilot can do is fight the enemy's fight. If the MiG wanted an American fighter to slow down and turn tightly, then following it into that situation might be exactly what the Soviet-designed aircraft wanted. Instead, American pilots needed to understand their own aircraft's advantages. The F-4 had size, power, sensors, weapons, 2 engines, a large crew in many configurations, and tremendous overall capability. The challenge was to use those advantages without allowing the MiG to drag the engagement into a situation where they mattered less. HAVE DOUGHNUT turned that idea into something tangible. American pilots could now experience the MiG from both sides. They could fly the MiG, then climb into an American aircraft, then fight it, then switch sides again. The enemy's behavior was no longer mysterious. It was becoming familiar. The secret Air Force. For the people working around the MiG at Groom Lake, secrecy was not a side issue. It was the mission. The aircraft had to be hidden. The personnel had to be controlled. The flights had to remain secret. The United States possessed a Soviet fighter while the Cold War was still active. If the Soviet Union discovered that an American test program was operating an authentic MiG-21, the intelligence implications would be enormous. So the aircraft received an American identity, YF-110. The Soviet markings were replaced. The aircraft was absorbed into a secret American world where foreign technology could be studied without public scrutiny. The desert became a laboratory, and the MiG became a specimen. Area 51 without the aliens. Decades later, Area 51 would become synonymous with UFO stories. But its real history is already extraordinary enough. The CIA itself acknowledges that Groom Lake was used for secret aircraft programs including the U-2 and A-12 Oxguard. The MiG-21 story makes the location even more fascinating, because Area 51 was not merely a place where America developed its own aircraft. It was also a place where America studied the aircraft of its enemies. The desert offered something war could not: controlled conditions. The Americans could decide when the MiG flew. They could decide which aircraft would challenge it. They could repeat tests. They could observe. They could analyze. And unlike Vietnam, there was no surface-to-air missile waiting below. No political boundary. No enemy radar network. No bombing schedule. No North Vietnamese ground controller. Just aircraft. Pilot against pilot. Machine against machine. The MiG and the Phantom. The F-4 Phantom and MiG-21 represented two different philosophies. The MiG was compact and optimized for interception. The Phantom was a much larger multi-role fighter built around range, power, sensors, weapons, and flexibility. The two aircraft did not have to fight the same way. That became one of the most important lessons. If the American pilot treated the fight like a contest to see which aircraft could turn more tightly, he might be making the MiG's job easier. But if the American pilot understood when to preserve energy, when to disengage, when to use speed, and when to exploit the Phantom's other advantages, the balance could change. The secret tests did not reveal that one aircraft was universally superior. They revealed something much more useful. Each aircraft had a set of conditions under which it became dangerous, and a set of conditions under which it became vulnerable. That was tactical gold. The strange power of knowing your enemy. Imagine fighting a boxer you have never seen. You know his height. You know his weight. You have photographs. You have watched a few recordings. But you have never stood across from him. Then imagine secretly becoming the boxer. You learn how he moves, how he breathes, where he feels uncomfortable, how quickly he tires, which punches feel natural, which ones are difficult, and then you return to your own side. Now you are not guessing. That is essentially what the Americans were doing with the MiG. They were becoming familiar with the enemy, and that familiarity could save lives. The lessons didn't stay in Nevada. The MiG-21 evaluation did not end when the aircraft returned to Israel. The knowledge spread. The United States began developing better methods for training pilots to fight Soviet-style aircraft. The lessons contributed to a broader transformation in American fighter training. The U.S. Navy's Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, became famous for developing advanced air combat skills. And later, the Air Force's red flag exercises would create an even broader training environment designed to expose pilots to realistic combat conditions. The secret MiGs were part of this evolution. The goal was no longer simply to tell a pilot, "Here is what the enemy aircraft can do." The goal was to put the pilot into an environment where he could experience the threat, train against it, make mistakes, learn, and then go to war with that knowledge already inside his muscle memory. The Defense Intelligence Agency describes the HAVE programs as instrumental in understanding Soviet aircraft strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and unique characteristics, and says the lessons contributed to new air combat doctrine and training. That is a far bigger legacy than one secret aircraft in one secret hangar. The human factor. There was another lesson. It was one the Americans could not solve with technology. The pilot mattered. Great deal. Two aircraft could have almost identical performance, but the outcome could still be completely different, because one pilot recognized the threat first. One pilot made a better decision. One pilot conserved energy. One pilot maintained situational awareness. One pilot knew when to attack. And one pilot knew when to leave. HAVE DOUGHNUT helped demonstrate that air combat was not a simple contest of specifications. The aircraft mattered, but the human being controlling it mattered just as much. That was an uncomfortable lesson for an era increasingly fascinated with technology. The MiG's weakness was also ID's strength. The MiG-21 was brutally optimized. Its simplicity was part of its appeal. It was not trying to be everything. It was trying to be a fast fighter. That gave it strengths. But optimization always creates trade-offs. A small aircraft cannot carry unlimited fuel. A compact design cannot offer unlimited internal space. A fighter designed around speed and interception cannot necessarily provide the endurance of a much larger aircraft. The Americans needed to understand those trade-offs. Once they did, the MiG became less mysterious. It was still dangerous, but it was no longer unknown. And that difference is enormous in warfare. The psychological war. The MiG-21 was also a psychological weapon. Every time American pilots entered North Vietnamese airspace, they had to think about it. Where are the MiGs? How many are there? Are they already airborne? Are they behind us? Are they climbing? Are they waiting? That uncertainty consumed attention. And in combat, attention is a resource. A pilot thinking about one threat has less mental capacity for another. The MiG did not need to shoot down every American aircraft to be effective. Its presence changed American behavior. The United States therefore needed to destroy more than MiGs. It needed to destroy uncertainty. HAVE DOUGHNUT helped accomplish exactly that. The desert fights back. There is something almost surreal about the story. A Soviet fighter built in the heart of the Cold War was sitting in the Nevada desert. American mechanics were working on it. American pilots were flying it. American engineers were measuring it. American fighter pilots were fighting against it. And somewhere far away, Soviet engineers probably had no idea. The aircraft that had been designed to defend Soviet-aligned airspace was now helping the United States learn how to defeat Soviet-style air combat. That is one of the strange ironies of the Cold War. Weapons often teach their enemies how to defeat them. The MiG-21 wasn't magic. The secret evaluation did not reveal a secret button that made the MiG helpless. It revealed something more complicated. The aircraft was genuinely capable, could be dangerous, it could exploit poor tactics, it could punish an American pilot who underestimated it, but it had limitations. And once those limitations became known, American tactics could be adjusted. That was the real victory. Not making the MiG harmless, making it understandable. From Hanoi to Groom Lake, the distance between Vietnam and Nevada was enormous. But in the history of air combat, they were connected. Over Hanoi, American pilots experienced the problem. At Groom Lake, American pilots dissected the problem. In Vietnam, the MiG-21 appeared as an enemy. In Nevada, it became a teacher. And the teacher was brutally honest. It showed American pilots what the aircraft could do. It showed them what it could not do. And perhaps most importantly, it showed them what American pilots were doing wrong. The secret was not necessarily inside the aircraft. The secret was in the interaction between two aircraft. The MiG from the other seat. One of the most powerful advantages of flying an enemy aircraft is perspective. An American pilot flying the MiG could see the fight differently. From the MiG cockpit, he could experience how difficult it was to maintain certain maneuvers. He could feel how rapidly the aircraft's energy changed. He could see the American fighter from the perspective of an opponent. Then he could return to the F4. And suddenly the MiG looked different. That is the kind of knowledge that cannot be completely transmitted through a manual. You have to experience it. Why the United States needed red aircraft. The idea eventually became a central principle of American fighter training. If the enemy flies one way, train against that way. If the enemy uses different aircraft, replicate them. If the enemy uses different tactics, practice those tactics. and if possible, put your pilots against the real machine. The secret MiG programs helped create the foundation for that philosophy. Later American programs would operate captured or acquired Soviet aircraft and Soviet design systems. But HAVE DOUGHNUT was one of the early demonstrations of what was possible. The enemy could become the training partner. The real secret of Area 51. Area 51's greatest secret was not that a strange Soviet fighter had somehow appeared in Nevada. The real secret was what America could learn from it. The MiG-21 was intelligence in physical form. It could be flown, measured, examined, compared, and challenged. That made it far more valuable than a photograph. A photograph could show the shape of the aircraft. A flight could reveal how it moved, and a dogfight could reveal how it fought. That was the difference. The Cold War in one aircraft. If you wanted to explain the Cold War using a single airplane, the MiG-21 would be an excellent candidate. It represented Soviet engineering. It was flown by communist-aligned air forces. It fought American aircraft over Vietnam. It was captured through a carefully arranged defection. It was studied by Israel. It was loaned to the United States. It was secretly tested in Nevada. And its weaknesses were eventually turned into lessons for American pilots. The aircraft crossed borders without firing a shot, but the intelligence it carried had enormous consequences. The price of learning. Of course, the lessons came at a terrible cost. Vietnam had already shown that air combat theory could fail. American crews had been lost. Aircraft had been lost. Pilots had been captured or killed. The process of understanding the MiG was not academic. Every improvement in tactics had a human price behind it. The secret aircraft at Area 51 could help reduce that price in future engagements. That was the purpose. Learn in the desert so pilots might survive in combat. Train against the threat before meeting it for real. Make mistakes in Nevada instead of over North Vietnam. That philosophy would become a permanent part of American military training. The MiG that helped change American air combat. The significance of HAVE DOUGHNUT was therefore much larger than the aircraft itself. It helped reinforce the idea that fighter pilots needed realistic adversaries. Not generic targets. Not theoretical opponents. Realistic threats. Realistic tactics. Realistic aircraft. Realistic training. That idea eventually became central to American air combat culture. The United States learned that advanced technology alone could not guarantee air superiority. Training mattered. Tactics mattered. Experience mattered. And understanding the enemy mattered. A new kind of American pilot. The fighter pilot emerging from this era was different. He could not simply trust the aircraft specifications. He had to understand the opponent. He had to know when the enemy was strongest. He had to know when the enemy was vulnerable. He had to recognize the geometry of an engagement. He had to preserve energy. He had to maintain awareness. And he had to understand that the first rule of a dogfight was not necessarily to turn harder. Sometimes the best move was to refuse the fight the enemy wanted. The MiG-21 taught that lesson in the harshest possible classroom. The return. Eventually, the American evaluation period ended. The aircraft had been on loan. Its time in the United States was limited, but its impact continued. The knowledge gained during its evaluation became part of the broader American understanding of Soviet fighters. The physical aircraft eventually returned to Israel, but the most valuable part of the aircraft had already been copied. Not necessarily in metal, not necessarily in blueprints, in knowledge. American pilots now knew what it felt like to fly the MiG. They knew what it looked like in a fight. They knew how it behaved, and they knew what it wanted to do. That knowledge could not be returned to Israel. It stayed in American doctrine. The legacy of HAVE DOUGHNUT. The story of the MiG-21 at Area 51 is sometimes reduced to one sensational sentence. America secretly stole a Soviet fighter and flew it at Area 51. The real story is more complicated. The aircraft was not simply stolen by the United States. It came through Israel after an Iraqi pilot defected with it. Israel then made the aircraft available to the United States. The U.S. Air Force operated it under the designation YF-110. The evaluation was conducted under HAVE DOUGHNUT, and the aircraft became part of a broader effort involving American intelligence, Air Force, and Navy personnel. The truth is less like a Hollywood theft and more like a Cold War intelligence operation. And in some ways, that makes it even more fascinating. The aircraft that became the enemy. The MiG-21 had been created to fight Western aircraft. But once it arrived in Nevada, it was being used to teach Western aircraft how to fight MiGs. The hunter became the teacher. The enemy became the training partner. And the secret fighter sitting inside Area 51 became one of the most valuable tools American air combat planners could imagine. That is the paradox. The United States did not need to destroy the MiG to defeat it. It needed to understand it. What the Americans really discovered. The Americans discovered that the MiG-21 was neither invincible nor inferior. It was dangerous when used correctly. vulnerable when forced into the wrong conditions, and unpredictable when American pilots did not understand its strengths. That may sound simple, but in war, simple lessons are often the hardest to learn. A pilot needs to know exactly what the enemy can do. More importantly, he needs to know what the enemy cannot do. That difference can be measured in seconds, and seconds decide air battles. The view from today. More than half a century later, the MiG-21 still looks remarkably futuristic. Its narrow fuselage, its sharply swept wings, its circular intake, its small silhouette, its aggressive nose. The aircraft looks like a weapon designed around one idea: speed. But history reveals another characteristic: adaptability. The MiG-21 was built by the Soviet Union. It served across the world. It fought American aircraft. It was flown by Iraqi pilots. It was captured by Israel. It was evaluated by the United States. And it became a training tool for generations of American airmen. Few aircraft have traveled such a strange path through Cold War history. The lesson over Hanoi. The MiG-21's greatest lesson was not that American aircraft were bad. They weren't. The F-4 Phantom was an extraordinarily capable fighter. The lesson was that capability means very little without understanding. American pilots had to learn that technology could create confidence. But confidence without knowledge could become overconfidence. The MiG forced American air crews to respect the opponent, and that respect produced better tactics, better training, better preparation, and eventually better survival. Why the MiG still matters. Modern fighters are almost unimaginably more advanced than the aircraft of the Vietnam era. Still, active electronically scanned array radars, network sensors, long-range missiles, data links, electronic warfare, satellites, unmanned aircraft, artificial intelligence. Yet one lesson from the MiG-21 remains completely relevant. Know the enemy, know your own aircraft, know the environment, and never assume that a technologically sophisticated weapon automatically guarantees victory. Because every weapon has limitations. Every radar has weaknesses. Every missile has conditions in which it performs better or worse. Every aircraft has an envelope, and every pilot has a decision to make. The secret that outlived the war. The Vietnam War eventually ended. The Cold War eventually ended. The Soviet Union eventually disappeared. But the knowledge gained from studying Soviet aircraft did not disappear. The United States continued developing realistic adversary training. It continued studying foreign aircraft. It continued creating organizations and exercises designed to replicate enemy tactics. The philosophy born from experiences like HAVE DOUGHNUT became deeply embedded in American air power. Train against the threat. Study the threat. Understand the threat. And then build tactics around reality rather than assumptions. That philosophy remains one of the foundations of modern air combat training. The most important aircraft in the hangar. Inside a secret hangar in Nevada, the MiG-21 may have looked like just another fighter. But to American intelligence officers, it was a library. Every panel contained information. Every engine component offered clues. Every flight revealed something. Every dogfight answered a question. And every answer could eventually reach a pilot. That is what made the aircraft so valuable. It was not merely a machine. It was information that could fly. The moment the mystery disappeared. Over Vietnam, the MiG-21 had been a mystery. In Nevada, the mystery began to disappear. The Americans could finally see it from every angle. They could hear its engine, feel its acceleration, watch it maneuver, fight it, and then fight it again. The psychological advantage of the MiG was slowly being taken away. The unknown became known. And once something becomes known, it becomes easier to defeat. The MiG-21 FUT's strangest mission. The fighter had been designed to defend Soviet interests. It had been built to intercept Western aircraft. It was intended to be a weapon of the Cold War. But one of its strangest missions took place far from the Soviet Union, in the Nevada desert, against American aircraft, with American pilots, under American control. The MiG-21 was fighting the very aircraft it had been designed to defeat, and the Americans were studying every second, from enemy to instructor. The MiG-21 became an instructor, not because it was friendly, not because it was superior, but because it forced American pilots to confront reality. It showed them what a small, fast interceptor could do. It showed them how quickly an engagement could change. It showed them that an enemy aircraft should never be judged by size alone. And it demonstrated the power of knowing the opponent from the inside. The United States did not simply want to beat the MiG. It wanted to think like the MiG. That was the real breakthrough. The final dogfight. Picture the Nevada desert one last time. The sun is low. The mountains are dark against the horizon. The runway is almost invisible from a distance. Inside a secure hangar sits a fighter built on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Its nose points toward the desert. Its Soviet heritage is hidden beneath American markings. The aircraft is no longer anonymous. American pilots know it. American engineers have studied it. American intelligence officers have measured it. And American fighter crews have fought it. The engine starts. The aircraft rolls. Then it accelerates. For a few moments, the desert is filled with the sound of a machine designed for a completely different war. A machine that once appeared over Hanoi as a threat. A machine that once forced American pilots to react. A machine that once represented uncertainty. Now it is flying for America. And somewhere inside another cockpit, an American pilot is watching. But this time the pilot knows what he is looking at. He knows how the MiG wants to fight. He knows its strengths. He knows its limitations. And he knows that the aircraft is no longer a mystery. That may have been the greatest victory of all. The real weapon was knowledge. The story of the MiG-21 over Vietnam is often told as a story about aircraft. American jets against Soviet jets. F-4 against MiG-21. Technology against technology. But that is only half the story. The deeper story is about knowledge. America learned that the enemy's strengths could become predictable. It learned that technology could not replace training. It learned that pilots needed realistic adversaries. And it learned that sometimes the fastest way to understand an enemy was to climb into his cockpit. The MiG-21 provided that opportunity. And the United States exploited it. The Cold War's strangest trophy. The MiG-21 was not a trophy in the traditional sense. It was not placed on a pedestal. It was not paraded through the streets. For years, almost nobody knew it existed in American hands. Its greatest value came from secrecy. The less people knew about it, the more useful it became. And while the public saw the Vietnam War unfold through television and newspapers, a hidden group of American pilots and engineers was studying one of the enemy's most important fighters in the Nevada desert. That parallel history is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Cold War. There was the visible war. And there was the secret war for information. The air war after the MiG. The lessons of Vietnam eventually changed American thinking about air combat. The United States became increasingly serious about realistic fighter training, aggressor aircraft, red air tactics, large-scale exercises, dedicated fighter schools, air combat maneuvering, scenario-based training. The goal was to make combat less mysterious before the pilot ever reached the battlefield. The HAVE programs were an important part of that evolution. The Defense Intelligence Agency notes that the exploitation of the MiG and other Soviet aircraft helped reveal strengths and weaknesses and contributed to new doctrine and training methods. The lesson was simple. If you cannot predict what the enemy will do, train until you can. Why the story sounds like a movie. An Iraqi pilot. A secret defection. A Soviet fighter. Israel. American intelligence. A hidden airfield. A Nevada desert. A classified test program. American pilots flying the enemy's aircraft. And a fighter that had once baffled American crews over Hanoi now flying against American aircraft under the most secretive conditions imaginable. It sounds fictional, but the core story is real. The MiG-21 really did make its way from Iraq to Israel. It really was made available to the United States. It really was evaluated under HAVE DOUGHNUT. And it really did fly at Groom Lake under the American designation YF-110. The truth is already cinematic. It does not need aliens. It does not need conspiracy theories. It only needs the Cold War. The final lesson. The MiG-21 was dangerous because American pilots did not fully understand it. Once they understood it, the aircraft did not suddenly become harmless. Instead, American pilots became better. That distinction matters. The enemy did not have to become weaker. America had to become smarter. The United States did not defeat the MiG-21 by building a magical aircraft specifically designed to destroy it. It defeated uncertainty by studying the enemy. It turned combat experience into intelligence. It turned intelligence into tactics. It turned tactics into training. And it turned training into doctrine. That process is one of the reasons modern American Air Forces place such enormous value on realistic adversary training. The last image. Imagine that secret Nevada runway again. A MiG-21 sits beneath the desert sky. Its silhouette is unmistakable. A Soviet fighter. A Cold War weapon. A machine that once hunted American aircraft. But now its purpose is different. It has become a teacher. Its greatest contribution to American air power is not the number of enemy aircraft it could destroy. It is the knowledge it gave to the people trying to defeat it. Over Hanoi, the MiG-21 had represented uncertainty. At Groom Lake, uncertainty became data. Data became tactics. Tactics became training. And training eventually became survival. That is the story hidden behind the famous fences of Area 51. Not little green men. Not flying saucers. But a Soviet fighter sitting in the Nevada desert while American pilots learned how to beat it. The MiG-21 disappears into history. The Cold War eventually ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world changed. But the MiG-21 remained. It continued flying in countries around the world. Its design proved remarkably durable, and its story became part of a larger history of military aviation. But for American air combat, one of its most important chapters happened in secret. The aircraft that once challenged American pilots over Vietnam became an American training tool. The enemy became the instructor. The mystery became a machine that could be measured, and the lessons learned from it would outlive the aircraft itself. The final word. There is a reason military organizations study their enemies so obsessively, because the most dangerous opponent is not necessarily the strongest one. It is the one you do not understand. Over North Vietnam, the MiG-21 was small, fast, difficult to see, and dangerous enough to force the United States to rethink how it fought in the air. So America did something remarkably simple. It found a MiG, it brought it to the desert, and it learned. The aircraft was flown, examined, tested, and fought. The secrets of the MiG-21 were not protected by some mysterious Soviet wall forever. For a brief period, they were sitting in a hangar in Nevada, and American pilots walked through that hangar. They climbed into the cockpit, they started the engine, and they discovered what the enemy saw. That was the real breakthrough. Not a new missile, not a new radar, not a new fighter. Knowledge. Because in aerial warfare, the difference between being hunted and being the hunter can sometimes be nothing more than understanding what the other aircraft can do. Over Hanoi, the MiG-21 had been a question. At Area 51, America finally got the answer. And once America knew how the MiG wanted to fight, the game changed forever. The aircraft that had once baffled American jets became one of the most valuable teachers the United States Air Force and Navy could have asked for. A Soviet fighter. A secret American test aircraft. A Cold War intelligence prize. And, for a few extraordinary months in the Nevada desert, the enemy was finally sitting in America's cockpit. That is how the MiG-21 went from being one of the most frustrating threats over Hanoi to becoming one of the most important aircraft America secretly studied at Area 51. And that is why, decades later, the story still matters. Because the greatest advantage in war is not always speed. It is not always firepower. It is not even technology. Sometimes, the greatest advantage is simply knowing what your enemy will do before he does it. And in the secret skies above Groom Lake, America learned exactly